Folks, this is still the Ways and Means Committee, and it is still Thursday, April 16th. It is 10:45. We are continuing our work on an act relating to income tax brackets and investment income. Really happy to be joined today by Miles Trinidad from ITEP, and the floor is yours. Oh, wait,
Great.
there you are. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to the opportunity to present to you all today. Let me just share my screen really quickly to do my presentation. Okay, it should be there. Let me present. Oh, no, I'm getting a pop-up. There we go.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Great. So again, thank you for having me. I'm Miles Trinidad. I'm a state analyst at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. We're a tax research organization based in DC. And I'm here to discuss the ins and outs of the wealth proceeds tax, as well as creating a new top marginal tax bracket for high income households. The bulk of this presentation is focusing on the wealth proceeds tax. My colleagues Sarah Austin and Carl Davis wrote a report on this policy explaining the reasoning behind it, the types of income subject to it, and a 50-state analysis of the revenue potential of the tax. And much of what I'm presenting today can be found within that report. And much of this presentation is focusing on the history of it, its potential to be administered at the state level, and the reasoning behind levying this tax, and focusing on those who are owning wealth. And I'll also touch very briefly at the end on how this can boost tax equity in the state, especially within the context of the recent tax cuts for the wealthy we've seen in the federal tax bill that just became law. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me, as I may not be able to see you. But there will also be opportunity to ask questions at the end as well. So with that, let's get started. So a little bit about the background of this tax. The origin of this tax, which can also be called the net investment income tax or investment proceeds tax, started at the federal level and started with the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. The bill included major expansion in federal funding for healthcare, and the expansion is funded in part with an additional payroll tax on wages called the additional Medicare tax, and the sister tax called the net investment income tax, or the NIT. The NIT tax is passive income not earned through work, which is the focus of this bill today. Including the NIT and the ACA ensured that workers would shoulder the cost of healthcare expansion on their own, and that wealthy investors would also be contributing. And to be very clear, this is not a tax on wealth. Rather, it's an indirect tax on the proceeds derived from wealth. So these are like the dividends received from owning corporate stock or interest generated from bond holding. It should be considered an indirect way to get closer to taxing wealth without having to set up an administrative system that formally measures taxpayers' wealth, since it piggybacks on the existing federal tax. So getting into the nitty gritty of this tax, this NIT is a federal tax levied at a rate of 3.8%. It's only on passive capital gains, dividends, interest, business income, and certain annuities. And because it's only focused on passive income, it excludes income of the types that are related to a business or a trade that the filer is currently working in. And on the federal level, it only applies to those earning over $200,000 for single filers and $250,000 for joint filers. And if a filer's income is below that threshold, they do not owe any of this tax, period, regardless if their income is from wealth or work. It's only for those who have that income above that threshold.
Miles, do you mind speaking a little bit slower? There's like a little muffle on your voice.
Oh, okay. I'll try to be a bit slower.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. Okay. So the reason I'm telling you all of this is because this federal policy offers a valuable framework for states looking to tax passive income on high income households. As you see in this pie graph here on the right, in 2022, just 4% of Vermont households owed this federal tax on their passive income. And the federal NIT is built around an IRS audited definition of passive income that states can conform to create their own tax and kind of piggyback on this federal tax. An example of that is Minnesota, that did just that in 2023. At the time, Minnesota lawmakers were looking for a way to fund free school meals and chose this tax on passive income as one major part of that package. And rather than opening up a big, messy debate on how to define passive income, lawmakers piggybacked off the NIT, which is generally quite sensible. They made some adjustments on the state level to the federal structure. In Minnesota, they increased the threshold to $1 million and exempted certain agriculture property, and then just applied a rate of 1%. And we expect that this tax will bring in about $68 million in revenue in Minnesota. Another lesson from Minnesota is how simple this tax is to administer. And just because they chose to conform to the federal tax, even with some departures from the federal structure, Minnesota's tax fits on a single page worksheet. And the fact that the IRS already issued guidance on the federal NIT and already audits and flags non-compliant returns, it makes this policy super simple to administer and easy to comply with. Looking a little bit closer at the proposal in Vermont, we're going to look at how this proposal in Vermont piggybacks off the federal NIT. So this bill today would create a 4% wealth proceeds tax on investment income. And like the federal tax, this tax would apply to individuals, estates, and trusts with investment income over the federal threshold amounts. So that's about $200,000 for single filers, $250,000 for joint filers. In addition to the passive income tax at the federal level, this bill also incorporates a few modifications that I will describe in a moment. The bill also guards against guards against using trusts that unfairly avoid this tax, which I know is on the committee's mind after some of the testimony, I think in the past, and I'll touch briefly on this topic later. And so, a couple with $250,000 of income would be completely exempt, while a couple with $300,000 of income would see, a vast majority of their income exempted by virtue of this threshold. So the most meaningful impacts of this tax are at those at the very top of the income and wealth scales. And so digging deeper into who is and who is not subject to the NIT, on the left, you can see examples of filers who would not owe any tax. So someone with only investment income, which you see on the far left with the green, someone with investment and wage income that is below the threshold amount, or on the blue bar on the right, someone who has a very high salary but zero investment income. We estimate about 96% of all Vermonters fall into this camp who would not owe anything under this proposed tax. On the right, you can see examples of two types of filers, one with all investment income, and then the other with a high salary supplemented by some investment income at the top. We see with the green at the top. Both of these filers would pay a tax only on the portion of their investment income that exceeds the threshold amounts, and we find that about 4% of Vermonters would fall into this category. And to be clear, the tax is only owed on the green shaded part of the income that appears above the red line. So on the right half of the slide, both of these folks have similar overall incomes, and both are paying the NITs, but the person represented by the green shaded column is going to pay quite a bit more because they're more reliant on the passive income derived from wealth, as opposed to wage income or active business income. That's important to understand why we think of this tax as a proxy for a wealth tax. Here, there's two people reporting similar incomes on their tax forms, but one of them is likely much wealthier than the other, as evidenced by the kind of income that they receive. So they end up paying more tax under this proposal, which we think is an appropriate outcome if you're looking to diversify your tax base and be more cognizant on not just income, but of wealth as well. So digging a bit more into what's included in the tax base of the wealth proceeds tax, the federal taxes capital gains from selling property, also includes stocks, dividends, payouts of corporate profits to shareholders, royalty income, trust income, interests. But then this bill in Vermont to make some modifications to what was included in the federal bill. So it starts with excluding federal bond interest, which states cannot legally tax. And then the bill adds interest from both out-of-state bonds and capital gains to the extent they're excluded from the federal bill. That includes business sales, opportunity zones, qualified small business stock exclusions. And it's important to know that all of these capital gains are federally tax preferred, meaning that they are taxed at a lower rate than someone who has a W-2 or gets purely only their income from wage income. And the capital gains from opportunity zones and qualified small business stocks are often completely tax-free at both the state and federal level. So again, digging deeper into this kind of disparity in how these types of income are treated differently in the tax system. Wealth proceeds are very lightly taxed income at the federal level. Long-term capital gains and qualified dividends, we estimate to make up over 80% of the base of this tax, and they face federal tax rates that top out at about 23.8%, which you can see on the right side of this slide. And then top federal rates on wages are 70% higher. They top out at about 40.8% when considering the income tax. And then also considering then its sister payroll tax called the additional Medicare tax. So you can see a lot of these taxes that are in this proposal are already very much tax advantaged at the federal level. And then digging deeper into this tax difference between the federal level between wage and non-wage income, about 83% of the tax base proposed in a wealth proceeds tax enjoys preferential federal income tax treatment. In addition, all of the income tax by this proposal is currently excluded from state unemployment insurance and federal FICA and SECA payroll taxes. This table goes into further detail on the types of income at issue here and the federal tax treatment. And then moving on, another technical focus on the treatment of trusts and estates that would owe tax under certain circumstances. So trusts hold wealth that is often invested, and when those profits or those investments yield profits, income tax is owed only on the profits generated in a tax year and only if the trust doesn't pay out the profits to its beneficiaries. Tax planners often promote state tax avoidance through what we call ING trusts, or incomplete non-grantor trusts, that shift income out of state. So this bill includes language modeled after New York to nullify the income shifting effects of these trusts and bringing the income from these trusts back under the rightful jurisdiction of the Vermont tax code. So this is important to include in the wealth proceeds tax because passive income is super easy to move into trusts. So this is worth having under radar more generally because there's reason to be believed and be concerned that some aggressive use of ING trusts might already be undercutting Vermont's personal income taxes revenue as well. And ideally, some kind of language along these lines would be inserted more broadly into the tax code under both the personal income tax and this proposal for a wealth proceeds tax. And then, so most of this presentation, I've been talking a lot about what a wealth proceeds tax is, but I also want to be very clear on what it isn't. There's very much a few points of common confusion that we find when discussing this tax, and I want to be clear on the types of income identified that are strictly excluded from this tax. So firstly, we have capital gains from selling a primary residence. This is not included up to about $250,000 in gains for single filers, $500,000 for married filers. And it's important to note that these are numbers related to the net profit from the home, so not the full sale price. And then while these wealth proceeds tax do not include profits from passive business investments, they do include profits from passive business investment. They do not include business profits from a business that a filer is, quote, materially participating in. So this is a test that's generally a requirement for a minimal number of hours, usually as few as 100 hours spent over a tax year. So most business income is not passive and is therefore exempt from this tax. We're only talking about taxing a sliver of business income that wealthy folks collect passively from a business where they have an ownership stake, but they're not involved in running it. In a way, it's somewhat analogous to taxing the dividends that a corporate stockholder might receive from the ownership of their stock from a Fortune 500 company. So the tax is consistent in this way. And finally, to be clear, traditional retirement income is fully exempt from this tax. So that's Social Security, pensions, 401ks, 403bs, qualified annuities. This is a super crucial point. Just to be super clear, this bill does not tax retirement income. So we estimate that this proposal would raise about $75 million in the state. And this would come at a particularly good time as the state navigates federal funding cuts for hunger and healthcare programs. And in addition, this tax is very well designed to target income that is highly tax deferred at the federal level and avoid further taxing families that are already struggling to make ends meet. So that was a big focus on the wealth proceeds tax, but I also want to kind of briefly touch on the proposal as well to create a new marginal income tax bracket for individuals earning above, I think it's about 480,000 or $580,000.
Before
Yes.
Miles, before you do that, can you go back to that trust loophole that you were talking about and just spend another moment on
Yes.
that?
Yeah. Do you have a specific question on this?
Can you just explain it again?
Yeah. This is like super, super technical. I'd be happy to also like send something after this as well.
That would be
But
great. Thank you.
yeah. So just to go over it, it's like trust are a super easy way to kind of like shift income, passive income out of state. That should be rightfully under the jurisdiction of Vermont. So this bill contains, I think technical language to avoid that. And on top of that, it's also just important consideration in any tax legislation. So it should always just be in consideration.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then going back to this slide, so a reform on creating this new tax bracket is also a very effective way in bringing about a very genuinely progressive tax system. Progressive in the terms that, those who earn more should pay, a larger share of their income based on their ability to pay across the full income scale in Vermont. Looking at ITEF's analysis of the distribution of the state's tax system by income level, you can see that it's already a very generally progressive pattern overall, but that pattern falls apart at the top 5% of the income level, where affluent families are paying a lower effective tax rate as a share of their income compared to those earning less. In addition, when looking at the combined impact of the recent federal windfalls for the wealthy from the recent federal tax cut, this would even further reduce the progressive pattern in the state. And not only did the federal tax bill extend the windfalls from the 2017 TCJA, it expanded it. So if you look at this table on the right here, not only is it extending it, but these are what they're getting on top of what we saw in 2017. So you can see the richest 1% receiving about $57,000 on average in tax cuts. Meanwhile, those in the bottom 20% seeing about $110. So, peanuts compared to what the top 1% are receiving. So expanding on that idea, setting a higher rate on passive income rather than earned income is a good idea in principle, as mentioned before, as the federal rate on this income is quite low. And again, our expectation is that this bill today is likely to result in a state tax system that is truly progressive. And I'm not quite sure if you've heard from Dr. Cristobal Young yet, but I also want to touch, I think he'll talk on this a bit more.
We have not heard from him. We have not heard from him yet, and that'll probably need to be next week. So
okay.
Please do share.
Okay. Well, I'll probably just give you a very surface level of it. He's like very much the expert on this topic. But one of the most discussed issues in tax policy is, of course, the concern of millionaire tax flight, or that millionaires are fleeing states with high income tax rates in significant numbers for those with lower rates. And there's no doubt that people occasionally move because of taxes. I do think that's very clear. But it's equally clear that the scale of these moves is smaller than commonly thought. Now, the bottom line is there's very little evidence to support the myth of large scale, mass exodus of millionaire tax migration. So why is that the case? It's because, like most people, they're economically and socially tied to where they are currently living. They're likely to have a family, kids, know the area, have community connections. They're also more likely to be working rich, where moving could actually set them back in their career and productivity. And there's a reason why they move to these places in the first place. Whether it's career opportunities, education, public services, or quality of life. By the time they make enough to think about moving to save on their taxes, they're already deeply embedded in their communities and live comfortably enough that the tax savings from moving would not fundamentally change their quality of life, even if they would receive, tax windfall in another state. On the other hand, young college graduates or low-income people seeking higher pay or better quality of life are much more mobile groups. And state income taxes are just not a main consideration for their decisions on where to move. Just because under most income tax systems, like graduated income taxes like that in Vermont, the effective income tax rates, don't tend to be very high for people with smaller incomes. So when considering this bill, if economic growth and population growth are concerns, instead of worrying about millionaire tax flight in the long run, what will make Vermont attractive to attract and retain top earners are robust investments in public infrastructure and providing good schools, healthcare, quality jobs that attract these people and lead them to stay. And frankly, failing to provide these things risks harming the Vermont economy in a way that a tax hike on millionaires never could. So on that note, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Miles, just a question on a previous slide when you're talking about total taxes as a percentage of income. That one.
Yeah.
And what are all of the taxes you're including in that calculation there?
That's a good question. So there's more of this in our Who Pays report, but overall, this includes like almost every tax in the state and local level in Vermont. So these are property taxes, sales and excise taxes, personal income taxes. I need to look back at our report, but I think we cover about 99% of all taxes in the state. So this is looking at every single tax that people are paying in the state, and looking at how that compares as a share of their income.
Okay, and interesting. Where is that data actually coming from? I don't know the answer to the question.
Ooh, okay, so that's like a huge methodology question, but we get this the data from IRS tables, American Community Surveys, state statistics of income reports. So we gather data from a variety of official government sources, and then we put it in our micro simulation data. Not to bore you with a lot of the details and methodology of it all, but in short, we get this data from state tax statistics.
Yeah, Representative.
Could you go to your last slide?
Oh, sorry, last slide. Oh, no, I'm at the beginning.
Oh, sorry.
All right, this one, yeah.
The last bullet point, talking about to invest in public services. What guarantee is there that money would go to public services? I mean, we're looking at now putting it in the general fund. That isn't a guarantee that it goes to public services.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. That's definitely a political consideration. But thinking of an example, well, if you're putting this general funds, if you do not have a robust tax system, where sometimes maybe you may not be able to weather an economic downturn, you would ultimately have to do tax cuts or service cuts, or not tax cuts, sorry, tax increases or service cuts. So if you don't have a robust enough tax system, you end up ending up having to cut these services that would attract people in the first place. So ultimately, where this money goes is a political consideration. Today I was mainly focused on presenting on the taxes being debated today. But the way the revenue is used is ultimately, a political consideration.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask on the previous slide what the date of the data on the left was. There's a date on the right, a date on the left.
Oh, yes. So this was published. So this data is based on 2024 incomes. We published this in 2024. And we generally publish this is like our marquee publication. I think we publish it around every 4-5 years or so. So this is the most recent iteration of this data.
So this would presumably be before the payroll tax.
I think we may have included that. I need to double check because we have like an appendix where we saw future tax changes happening. So we tried to account for that. But I can follow up on that with more information.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
I'm sorry, does it include property tax? I can't remember if you said that.
Oh, yes, it includes property taxes as well.
Thanks.
Any further questions? Yeah, Representative Burkhardt.
Miles, I'm confused about the chart on the right. We've heard at least 2 different explanations of what that chart is telling us. We've heard from our tax department that $57,000 tax cut is really the tax cut that came with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017. And that is basically maintaining a tax cut that was already in place. And then we've heard other advocates tell us that that is a new tax cut on top of what was there already. I'm confused. Can you just explain, since it's your chart, what that chart means?
Yeah, great question. It is very confusing, but to be clear, this is showing the effects of expanding on top of the TCJA. So like, treating that as a baseline, this is what people are getting on top of it. So it's Yeah, so we're not including, any tax cuts and then adding on top of it. It's very much, what people are getting on top of that tax bill or with this recent tax bill. Does that make it clear?
No,
It doesn't, so we've had the exact opposite testimony that it was really showing the extension. So the removal of the sunset, if you will, of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So we've had exactly opposite testimony that the 57,000 is not on top of the TCJA tax cuts, but it's rather just showing what folks have already had as a tax cut that they've already factored into their budgets for the last 8 years.
Okay, so this analysis shows that it was assuming that the TCJA would have been extended. And then with that, using that as a baseline, how would the recent federal tax bill be on top of it? So, it's kind of assuming TCJA is the zero. And then how OB3, the federal tax bill, would be on top of it. So it's not it's not adding any of the tax cuts from the TCJA or like anything in that as like in that amounts that you see in that average tax cut.
Okay, thank you.
anyone else? Thank you so much for joining us, and for the continued great work of your organization, particularly the Who Pays report.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Miles.
Bye.
Okay, so we're gonna put aside this bill. Really encourage folks to please let me know if there are other witnesses you want to hear from next week. I have staff team to talk about TCJA. That's a hard one to say. The Vermont Futures Project and the CPAs. But let me know if there's any more. Thanks. So we are going to move to an amendment. That Representative Kimball and I are putting forward to our amendment to 955. And I'm going to pull it up. I'm doing lots of method transitioning while talking simultaneously. It might be a little too much for my brain today. So if whichever one of you. Okay, can you? Some combination, please. Thank you. It is not, these are not major amendments, team. One of them, the first one is the addition of, I'm calling it a widget on the tax department's website. And the amendment's posted. The addition of a widget on the tax department's website. I don't know if you remember, but we had a conversation about all the great modeling work that JFO is going to be doing next year and the different changes we will make next year and additions and work, and how the study committees can get access to that information. And so rather than having them sort of track our work in real time the way, say, superintendents do, the tax department is going to create a website widget with thank yous to the tax department for that. And then the second is a technical change. And the third is to add just a little more extra language to the CDAC report that the treasurer is doing, so that that was at the request of the Corrections and Institutions Committee. And now our very lovely staff team will talk us through them.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm John Gray with the Legislative Council.
St. James Office of Legislative Council. Did you see this, say this amendment is on your website? It's under committee. Oh, okay.
I got it. You want me to share?
Sure. Oh, okay.
Just ask a quick numbering question.
Oh.
So the amendment is labeled draft number 4.1. So it's 4.1 of that amendment because we voted out draft 4.2.
Yeah, it's I believe it's 4.1 of
It's
that.
draft 4.1 of this document, of this Word document.
Okay, I just,
It was one instance of amendment and then became another instance of amendment, and then it became a third instance of amendment, and then probably a word change
Yep.
somewhere.
The first instance of amendment adds one new section to the bill, section 18A, that requires tax to develop that widget, although we don't use that fun word in the session law. So on or before October 1st, 27, the Department of Taxes shall publish on its website an interactive education funding calculator, which we're just going to call the interactive calculator, that enables a school district or a union school district study committee to calculate an estimate of the total education funding from the state it received under Vermont's current education finance system in fiscal year 27, and the estimated total education funding it would have received from the state under the new financing formula had it been in effect in fiscal year 27. The interactive calculator shall reflect all education finance policy choices represented in the total appropriated state funds each school district receives under Vermont's existing education funding formula that are enacted through July 1, 27 that would have an impact on funding levels. In developing the interactive calculator, the taxes shall consult with JFO, AOE, and the Department of Finance and Management. On or before August 1st, the department is required to submit a preliminary plan for the calculator to JFO and AOE for feedback. And they're also required to submit a preliminary version of the interactive calculator to the Joint Fiscal Committee in September of 27.
So Madam Chair, I guess I don't understand how that can happen. I mean, how can the tax department an interactive education funding calculator for school districts or union school districts that haven't been created yet?
So they would create a widget that had all the towns and then had the ability to smush towns. And then the person who is interacting, this is very formal language I'm using here. And then whoever was going into it could sort of put the request in, and then the widget would do the smushing.
Okay, thank you.
Smart widget.
I think actually people do this already. Locally, what they're trying to do is create a tool that does it so that, I mean, districts are already modeling this. I think my question is, we know that there've been some pretty substantial errors. Is there a way to have, is who's providing the review before this becomes the operating document?
That's in there.
I know, but these are some of the same entities that have made the mistakes in the past. So my question is, who's,
So they're submitting it to the Joint Fiscal Office for feedback. And in my experience, the Department of Taxes does not make huge mistakes that they don't correct quickly. And then it's going to go to the Joint Fiscal Committee as well to review.
Second instance is a great catch by your Appropriations Committee, and that the rulemaking in section 27D regarding the length of school day does not have any date certain for that rulemaking to occur. So we've added language to require the rulemaking to occur on or before March 31st, 27, which is the same date you use for all the rulemaking in the bill.
Yep.
I will take a third of these. So the third instance of amendment is something that emerged out of discussions in the House Corrections and Institutions Committee. You will recall that the core provision of the state aid for school construction program, just for orientation purposes, has the application process, sets out the construction aid awards, contemplating both of that debt service subsidy and the additional state bonding capacity available. You'll recall the discussions that led to this, the initial version of this language, which was substituting for the proposed 50 million additional annual cap, a recommendation instead from the Treasurer's Office in consultation with CDAC to get what the appropriate state bonding capacity should be to support the program. The Corrections Institutions Committee had a position on, they wanted to have a say essentially in this matter. And so there's two things in this piece. Subdivision C, the Treasurer in consultation with CDAC shall recommend to the House Committees on Education, on Ways and Means, and on Corrections and Institutions, Senate Committees on Education, on Finance, and on Institutions. So addition of two new committees of jurisdiction, right? the annual total state bonding support available for the capital budget and this program, and the annual debt service subsidies to be awarded under this chapter. That sentence is the same as what you guys had, except that 2 new committees have been added to whom that recommendation is distributed. The real addition from that committee is they wanted to know how this affects the bonding capacity available for the general capital budget process. I would note that I think that's already going to happen because it necessarily is a holistic assessment, but you now have a very clear directive that needs to be called out. So that's what you see on line 16 through 18. The recommendation shall include an analysis of how the use of state bonding support for school construction under this program affects overall capital budget capacity. In other words, they kind of want to ensure that whatever is done doesn't supplant or leach into the capital budget.
Yeah, Representative Elizabeth?
Oh, good. I think I'm reading this the right way, but just not sure if there's other things that I could do that. So is this like an annual thing? So each year they will come back, or is this a one?
So I think the idea is you would regularly be recommended this annually. So this is the annual total state bonding support, which could vary yearly, right? CDEC also regularly makes this recommendation each biennium anyway to set out what the total state bonding capacity is. And you'll recall that this is part of that award of construction aid section, which sets out, the various measures for determining that 50, 95%. And then this is the measure that basically describes what funds would then be available for those purposes. So it's for the annual total state bonding support. Yep.
I just want to add, I attended a meeting with the Corrections Institutions Committee, or other way around, when John was presenting the bill and 955 and our amendment to it. Did a great job. Thank you, John. That was a great explanation. And they have main concerns about if we were going to getting $50 million from the total bonding capacity of the state, what was that going to do to any kind of future projects they had, whether it was for large construction of large facilities or maintenance of existing facilities. So they really wanted to know how that was going to impact them. So that was the kind of genesis for this. So like, yeah, you got a point. And so even though CDAC in its review would show what the total bonding was, we really want to know the intersection between this program and their regular program.
Thanks. Any other questions for Beth and John? Yeah, Representative Smith.
Actually, I'll save it for later.
Okay, thanks.
Good. The name mix up.
Representative Brannigan?
Is there a fiscal note for this? Is it cost any doing this?
Julia?
Julia Richard, JFO, there's not a fiscal note for this, and we don't anticipate there to be any additional costs to develop.
Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
Specific to the amendment, but we also did receive a letter from Rich Warner. What are we doing with that?
We are going to work on that in the Senate to catch ourselves up. The school construction program is not finished, not perfect, and I think a step in the right direction, and committed to figuring out that. No, thank you very much. Anyone else for the staff team? Great, thank you. Representative Maslin, do you want to say whatever you want to say before we vote on the amendment?
And get your name mixed up with someone in the Upper Valley named John Craig.
Oh,
And I was confused with which email was going back and forth. And apologize to anybody. There was no bad words. But this is John Craig. Oh, it's John Craig. No, it's I just wanted to clarify that.
John Gray.
there are also many John Grays out there.
I bet there are, and some of them are EY and some of them are AY.
I could tell you some fun stories, but I don't think this time is for that.
Another day.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, John.
Sure.
So we don't have custody of the bill, so this is a straw poll. All those in favor of finding this amendment favorable? All those opposed?
Straw poll is favorable 10-1-0.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We are done for the day, though please, there might be more amendments. Be attentive to all the things. And we are scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, but don't have anything scheduled also for amendment prep.